A billionaire empire is built on knowing every detail. But Caroline Sterling missed the biggest secret hiding in plain sight. It wasn't a ruthless rival or a corporate spy. It was the man emptying her trash bin and the life-altering truth he guarded at the edge of the city. The penthouse office of Sterling Global sat 72 floors above the glittering grid of Chicago, suspended in a permanent state of high-stakes isolation. At 34, Caroline Sterling was the undisputed queen of this glass and steel domain. A billionaire CEO who had ruthlessly expanded her late father's logistics empire into the realm of artificial intelligence, but heavy is the head that wears the crown. The board of directors, led by the venomous Richard Blake, was circling like vultures. They demanded a flawless launch of Project Aegis, a predictive routing algorithm that promised to revolutionize global shipping. The problem was, Project Aegis was fundamentally flawed. For 3 weeks, the code had been collapsing under its own weight, and Caroline's lead engineers were coming up empty. It was 11:45 p.m. on a damp Tuesday. The executive floor was a tomb of silent corridors and dimmed, recessed lighting. Caroline sat alone in the central boardroom, staring daggers at a massive glass whiteboard covered in complex, sprawling equations. She pinched the bridge of her nose, a dull migraine pulsing behind her eyes. The math wouldn't balance. The recursive loop in the algorithm kept failing. A soft ding from the service elevator broke the silence. Caroline didn't turn around. She knew the schedule. It was just the night shift cleaning crew. A few moments later, the hushed squeak of rubber-soled shoes and the quiet rattle of a utility cart announced the arrival of the janitor assigned to the executive suite. His name badge read Daniel. Caroline had seen him peripherally for the past 6 months. He was a tall man, perhaps in his late 30s, with broad shoulders that seemed permanently stooped under an invisible weight. His dark hair was always neatly trimmed, and his uniform, though faded, was impeccably pressed. He worked with a quiet, methodical efficiency, completely ignoring the wealth and power that surrounded him. To Caroline, he was part of the furniture, a necessary ghost who kept her sanctuary spotless. "Excuse me, Miss Sterling." Daniel's voice was a low, resonant baritone, surprisingly steady. "I need to empty the recycling bins in the corner. I can come back if you require privacy." "Just do it quickly, Daniel," Caroline muttered, her eyes never leaving the whiteboard. She turned her back to him, picking up her phone as it vibrated on the mahogany table. It was her chief technology officer, offering another string of pathetic excuses. Frustrated, Caroline paced toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, engaging in a hushed, furious argument, leaving Daniel to his work. 10 minutes later, she ended the call with a sharp tap of her screen and turned back to the whiteboard. She froze. The sprawling equation she had been staring at for hours had been altered. A single critical variable in the third quadrant, a localized integer that dictated the memory allocation, had been erased. In its place, written in precise, blocky red marker, was a modified derivative. Caroline's breath hitched. She scanned the math. It was a completely unorthodox approach, bypassing the recursive loop entirely and forcing the algorithm to distribute the data load laterally. She ran the numbers in her head. It worked. It perfectly, flawlessly worked. "Who was in here?" Caroline snapped, her voice echoing in the empty boardroom. She rushed to the doorway, looking down the long hallway. It was empty. The utility cart was gone. Heart pounding, Caroline marched straight to the security control room on the 50th floor. She bypassed the startled night guards and pulled up the raw footage of the boardroom. She watched the black and white feed. She saw herself walk to the window to take the call. She saw Daniel, the janitor, empty the bins. Then she watched as he stopped behind her. He stood before the glass whiteboard for a full 60 seconds, his eyes tracking the complex equations. He didn't look confused. He looked critical. He picked up the red marker, erased her CTO's flawed logic, wrote the solution, and quietly wheeled his cart out of the room. "Who the hell is this man?" Caroline whispered to herself. The next morning, Caroline summoned Greg Mitchell, her fiercely loyal head of security. She handed him a screenshot of Daniel from the security footage. "I want everything on him," Caroline ordered, her tone brooking no argument. "Background, financials, previous employers, known associates, everything." "He's a cleaner, Caroline," Greg noted, raising an eyebrow. "Employed by Apex Facility Services. Standard contractor. Did he steal something?" "Just do it, Greg." By noon, the file was on her desk. Caroline flipped through the pages, her frown deepening. The file was aggressively unremarkable. Daniel Porter, 38 years old, widowed. A single father to a 7-year-old girl named Chloe. Rented a small ground-floor apartment in the grim industrial outskirts of the South Side. No criminal record, no massive debts, just a mountain of standard medical bills. Before Apex, he had a string of odd jobs. Warehouse worker, delivery driver. "There's no higher education listed," Caroline muttered, tapping her manicured nail against the desk. "No tech background, no engineering degrees." "He's a ghost in the system," Greg agreed, standing on the other side of the desk, clean as a whistle. "If you're worried about corporate espionage, Richard Blake's people wouldn't use a guy with a sick kid and zero tech footprint. It's too messy." But Caroline wasn't convinced. You didn't just guess a lateral data distribution algorithm. That level of mathematics required a brilliant, highly trained mind. If Daniel Porter wasn't a corporate spy, then he was something much more dangerous, an unknown variable. And Caroline Sterling did not tolerate unknown variables in her empire. "Cancel my evening meetings," Caroline said, standing up and grabbing her trench coat. "I'm going to see exactly what Mr. Porter does when he clocks out." The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the neon lights of the city into a blurred, watery kaleidoscope. Caroline had swapped her recognizable silver Bentley for a nondescript black Ford sedan from the company fleet. She sat idling in an alleyway across from the service exit of the Sterling Global Tower. The dashboard clock read 12:15 a.m. The heavy steel door groaned open, and Daniel Porter stepped out into the downpour. He pulled the collar of his faded canvas jacket up against the chill, slinging a battered duffel bag over his shoulder. He didn't look left or right. He just kept his head down and started walking toward the subway station. Caroline put the Ford in gear and followed, keeping a block behind him. Her heart hammered a steady, anxious rhythm against her ribs. Part of her felt ridiculous, a billionaire CEO tailing a janitor in the middle of the night like a paranoid private eye. But the image of that red marker on the glass whiteboard burned in her mind. She tracked him to the Red Line station. Instead of driving home, Caroline parked the Ford illegally, pulled a dark baseball cap low over her face, and followed him down into the damp, echoing subterranean tunnels. She boarded the same train, sitting 2 cars down, watching him through the connecting glass doors. Daniel sat perfectly still, staring blankly at the floor. He looked utterly exhausted, a man running on fumes and sheer willpower. They rode for 40 minutes, far past the gleaming high-rises and affluent suburbs, deep into the rotting industrial underbelly of the city. The factories here had closed decades ago, leaving behind rusted skeletons of industry and forgotten neighborhoods. Daniel exited at the end of the line. Caroline shadowed him up the concrete stairs and out into the desolate streets. The streetlights flickered sporadically. Stray dogs picked through overturned trash cans. Daniel stopped at a glowing barred window of a 2 4-hour corner pharmacy. Caroline hid in the shadows of a defunct bus stop as she watched him count out crumpled bills to purchase a small white paper bag. Medicine. He continued his trek, finally approaching a crumbling 3-story brick building that looked like an abandoned textile mill. Most of the windows were boarded up, but a faint, bluish glow emanated from the ground floor. Daniel unlocked a heavy iron door and slipped inside. Caroline waited 3 minutes before crossing the street. Her expensive leather boots splashed through murky puddles. She approached the side of the building, tracing the brick wall until she found the source of the blue light. A narrow window, caked with grime, situated just above ground level. She crouched down, wiping away a patch of dirt with her gloved hand, and peered inside. What she expected to see was a secret rendezvous. She expected to see Richard Blake, or a competitor from a rival tech firm, handing Daniel a briefcase of cash in exchange for a USB drive containing her company's secrets. What she actually saw made her breath catch in her throat. The room was vast, a gutted warehouse floor, but it wasn't a living space. It was a makeshift, Frankenstein-esque laboratory. Industrial cooling fans hummed loudly, hooked up to a dozen towering server racks. Tangled webs of thick black cables snaked across the concrete floor like veins, connecting banks of glowing monitors to heavy-duty power supplies. In the center of this chaotic, technological jungle was a small, neatly kept clearing. A faded floral rug was laid out, and on it sat a medical bed. Lying in the bed was a little girl, no older than 7. She was pale, fragile, and hooked up to a portable oxygen concentrator. Chloe. Caroline watched, mesmerized, as Daniel knelt beside the bed. The exhaustion melted from his face, replaced by a soft, luminous smile. He brushed the hair from the little girl's forehead, kissed her cheek, and pulled a small bottle of liquid from the pharmacy bag, carefully administering a dose. But the real shock came when Daniel stood up and walked over to the main terminal of his makeshift server farm. As he sat down and began to type, the screens illuminated his face. Caroline squinted, focusing her eyes on the massive monitors visible through the glass. The screens were filled with cascading lines of code, complex 3D molecular structures, and rapid-fire data processing. Caroline was a tech CEO. She knew high-level architecture when she saw it. This wasn't just coding, this was genomic sequencing. It was a deeply sophisticated protein folding simulation, the kind of operation that required massive, unprecedented computing power. Power that a man living in a slum absolutely could not afford or possess. Then, she saw it. In the top right corner of Daniel's central monitor, a small, recognizable command prompt was running. It was a backdoor root directory. Connected. Sterling Global Mainframe. Sector 4. Quantum Array. Caroline's blood ran cold. Daniel wasn't a corporate spy stealing from her. He was a technological parasite. He had used his janitorial access to physically bypass Sterling Global's internal firewalls. Every night, while the company slept, this invisible man with a mop was hijacking Caroline's multi-million-dollar quantum servers, using her empire's vast computing power to run impossibly complex medical simulations in a desperate bid to save his dying daughter. He wasn't an uneducated cleaner. He was an absolute genius, hiding in the shadows, orchestrating a massive cyber heist right under her nose. Caroline stepped back from the window, the rain plastering her hair to her face. She had found her answer. But as she looked back at the devoted father typing furiously against the clock and the fragile little girl sleeping amid the hum of stolen servers, Caroline realized the situation was far more volatile and heartbreaking than she could have ever calculated. She reached into her coat, pulling out her phone to call Greg and have the police raid the building. Her thumb hovered over the dial button. She stared at the screen, the rain tapping relentlessly against the glass. For the first time in her life, the ruthless CEO hesitated. The following night, the penthouse suite of Sterling Global was entirely devoid of life, save for Caroline. She had explicitly dismissed the security detail on her floor, overriding the protocols with her executive access code. She sat in the darkness of the central boardroom, the only illumination coming from the sprawling skyline of Chicago, pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She waited. The digital clock on the mahogany table flipped to 12 a.m. Right on schedule. The service elevator dinged. The quiet rattle of the utility cart approached. The heavy oak door swung open, and Daniel Porter stepped inside, reaching for the light switch. "Leave them off," Caroline commanded from the shadows. Daniel froze. His hand hovered inches from the wall plate. Slowly, he lowered his arm, his eyes adjusting to the dim, ambient light of the city, bleeding into the room. He didn't panic. He didn't run. He simply stood there, his broad shoulders tensing under his faded uniform. Caroline stepped out of the darkness, holding a thick leather binder. She tossed it onto the glass conference table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "I didn't call the police," Caroline said, her voice a low, dangerous purr. "I didn't call the FBI, even though federal wire fraud and grand larceny of corporate data carry a 20-year minimum sentence. Instead, I spent the entire day looking into the real Daniel Porter. Or should I say, Dr. Daniel Porter, former lead architect of bioinformatics at the Mayo Clinic." Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked at the binder, then back to Caroline. "You were outside my window last night." "I was," Caroline admitted, circling the table. "And I watched a man who washes my windows hijack $12 million worth of quantum computing power. You've partitioned 3 terabytes of our mainframe to run a rogue protein folding simulation. You bypassed our AES 256 encryption using a physical tap on the server floor. It's brilliant. It's also corporate terrorism." "It's not terrorism," Daniel said, his voice surprisingly steady, though a tremor of pure exhaustion betrayed him. "It's a localized simulation. It doesn't affect your daily operations. I throttle the usage during peak hours so your network doesn't notice the drain." "You fixed my routing algorithm on that whiteboard," Caroline pointed out, gesturing to the glass wall. "Why?" "Because your CTO is an idiot who doesn't understand localized integer mapping," Daniel replied bluntly. "The error was giving me a headache, and I needed your servers running optimally so my simulation wouldn't crash." Caroline let out a harsh, dry laugh. "So, you optimized my billion-dollar logistics project just to ensure you could steal my bandwidth more efficiently?" "Yes." The sheer audacity of it left Caroline momentarily speechless. She crossed her arms, staring at the broken man in front of her. "The Mayo Clinic fired you 3 years ago. The records say you were caught embezzling laboratory resources to synthesize unapproved gene therapies. You lost your medical license. You were blacklisted from every major pharmaceutical company in North America. Why are you wearing a janitor's uniform, doctor?" Daniel closed his eyes. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once, leaving only the hollow shell of a desperate father. He leaned against the back of a leather chair. "My daughter, Chloe, has an atypical, aggressively mutated form of Lee syndrome," Daniel said, the clinical terms contrasting sharply with the raw pain in his voice. "It's a severe neurometabolic disorder. It destroys the central nervous system. The Mayo Clinic said it was incurable. They refused to authorize an experimental CRISPR trial. They said the computational modeling required to map the exact genetic target would take a supercomputer 5 years to render, and she only had 2. He opened his eyes, meeting Caroline's gaze with a fierce, burning intensity. "I wasn't going to let my little girl drown in her own body while bureaucrats debated funding. So, I took the research. I went underground, but I needed processing power. Sterling Global just installed the most advanced quantum array in the Midwest. Getting hired as a night shift cleaner by a third-party contractor was the only way I could physically access the server racks to install the back door." "And the simulation?" Caroline asked, her ruthless CEO persona faltering for a fraction of a second against the sheer gravity of his confession. "It's at 91%, Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "I am so close, Miss Sterling. I am mapping the exact protein sequence to arrest the degeneration. If I finish the render, I can synthesize the biologic and stop the disease. I just need more time." Caroline turned away, looking out at the glittering city. In her world, weakness was leverage. Pity was a liability. The board, specifically Richard Blake, would crucify her if they found out a janitor had compromised their network. But looking at the math on the board, and remembering the fragile little girl breathing through a plastic tube, an unprecedented, wildly dangerous idea began to form in her mind. "Project Aegis," Caroline said, turning back to him. "The algorithm you corrected on the whiteboard. The board of directors is threatening to oust me if it doesn't launch flawlessly by the end of the month. My engineers are drowning. The code is a mess." Daniel watched her warily. "I know. I've seen the raw data on your servers. It's bloated. I will give you an executive firewall bypass," Caroline said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. I will formally, quietly partition 20% of the quantum array exclusively for your simulation. Off the books. Fully protected from our internal security sweeps. Your simulation will finish in weeks, not months. Daniel gripped the back of the chair, his knuckles turning white, and in exchange, Dr. Porter, you are going to rewrite Project Aegis from the ground up, Caroline demanded, her eyes flashing. You will work from this boardroom every night. You will fix my logistics empire. If you fail, or if you tell anyone, I will have Greg Mitchell hand you over to the feds, and I will personally dismantle your server farm. Do we have a deal? It wasn't a choice. It was a lifeline wrapped in barbed wire. Daniel didn't hesitate. He looked the billionaire in the eye and nodded. We have a deal. The next 3 weeks became a surreal, high-stakes dual existence. By day, Caroline Sterling fought a brutal corporate war, fending off Richard Blake's relentless attempts to audit Project Aegis. By night, the penthouse transformed into a clandestine command center. Daniel Porter traded his mop for a bank of high-powered laptops Caroline had smuggled into the boardroom. They worked side by side in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. The dynamic between them was electric, fueled by mutual desperation and undeniable intellect. Daniel was a revelation. Stripped of his janitorial disguise, the brilliance of the former Mayo Clinic architect shone through. He dismantled the bloated logistics code with surgical precision, applying biological modeling theories to global shipping routes. He treated cargo ships and freight trains like blood cells, navigating a cardiovascular system, optimizing flow and eliminating bottlenecks with elegant, breathtaking mathematics. For her part, Caroline found herself unexpectedly invested in the blue progress bar, running on Daniel's secondary monitor, the genetic simulation for Chloe. She started bringing him strong coffee at 2 a.m. She asked questions about Lee syndrome. She found herself anonymously wiring funds to the pharmacy in the South Side to cover Chloe's palliative medications. Caroline Sterling, the ice queen of Chicago tech, was cracking. She realized that the empire she had inherited meant nothing compared to the singular, desperate purpose driving the man sitting across from her. By the end of the 3rd week, Project Aegis was not just fixed, it was revolutionized. The new algorithm was capable of predictive adjustments so fast it bordered on clairvoyance. It was a masterpiece, and Chloe's simulation was at 98.5%. 48 hours, Daniel said one Thursday night, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. The quantum array is finalizing the protein structure. Once it hits 100%, it outputs the synthesis formula. I take that to a private lab I've bribed in Hammond, and I make the serum. Caroline felt a strange, tight knot in her chest, a mixture of profound relief and an impending sense of loss. You saved my company, Daniel. You gave me the power to save my daughter, he replied softly, holding her gaze. The silence in the boardroom was thick, charged with something neither of them was willing to name. But a house of cards cannot withstand a storm, and the storm arrived the following morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Caroline was in her office, reviewing the final launch presentation for Aegis, when the doors burst open. Richard Blake strode in, flanked by 3 men in sharp gray suits. They weren't from the Sterling Global Legal Team. They wore badges from an independent forensic auditing firm. Good morning, Caroline, Blake said, a predatory smile twisting his face. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Caroline stood up slowly, her blood running instantly cold. Richard, what is the meaning of this? The board called an emergency session at 8 a.m. Without you, Blake announced smoothly, pacing across her Persian rug. We noticed a massive discrepancy in the company's power consumption and data load. A massive, hidden drain on the quantum array. Sector 4 has been firewalled off by an executive command. Your command. Caroline kept her face a mask of stone, though her pulse hammered wildly. I am stress testing Aegis in a partitioned environment. It's standard procedure. Don't lie to me, Caroline, Blake snapped, dropping a thick file on her desk. We brought in Deloitte's cyber forensics team. They bypassed your little firewall. They found the data. It's not logistics, it's bioinformatics. Massive, petabytes of medical simulations. Blake leaned over the desk, his voice a venomous whisper. The board believes you are embezzling company resources to run a shadow biotech startup, or worse, leasing our quantum tech to rivals on the black market. Either way, it is a gross violation of your fiduciary duty. You have no proof of that, Caroline said, her voice dangerously quiet. I don't need proof yet. I have the data logs, Blake sneered. As of 10 minutes ago, the board voted to suspend your executive privileges pending a full investigation. Security is locking down the servers. We are wiping the unauthorized partitions to protect the mainframe. No! The word tore from Caroline's throat before she could stop it. She lunged for her computer terminal, but the screens had already gone black, replaced by a flashing red padlock icon. System override. Terminal locked. Whatever illegal side project you were running, Caroline, it's gone, Blake said triumphantly. And so are you. Caroline's mind spun. The simulation, it was at 98.5%. If they wiped the partition, Daniel's 3 years of work, Chloe's absolute only chance at survival, would be erased in a matter of seconds. Millions of microscopic calculations, vanishing into the digital ether. She grabbed her coat and sprinted past Blake and the auditors, ignoring their shouts. She didn't wait for the elevator. She hit the stairwell, her heels echoing like gunshots as she flew down the concrete steps toward the server farm on the 45th floor. She burst through the heavy fire doors, gasping for air. The server room was a massive, freezing cavern of humming black obelisks. But Greg Mitchell and the IT security team were already there, typing furiously at the master control console. "Greg, stop!" Caroline screamed, running down the aisle. "I can't, Miss Sterling," Greg said, looking up with an apologetic but firm expression. "Mr. Blake has the board's authorization. The purge protocol has been initiated on Sector 4. The data is wiping." Caroline watched in horror as the progress bars on the master monitors went from green to red. The deletion was cascading through the drives. Suddenly, her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a restricted number. She answered with trembling hands. "Caroline." It was Daniel. His voice wasn't just panicked. It was shattered. The remote connection dropped. "My screens are dead." The simulation. "I know, Daniel. They found it. Blake found the partition," she choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "They're wiping the drives right now." There was a terrible, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. When Daniel finally spoke, it sounded like a man whose soul had just been crushed. "Chloe had a seizure this morning," he whispered. "The disease is accelerating. The doctors, they said her organs are beginning to fail. If I don't get that synthesis formula today, she won't make it through the weekend." The line went dead. Caroline lowered the phone, staring at the flashing red lights of the dying servers. She had spent her entire life protecting her father's legacy, building walls around her empire, calculating every risk. But in that freezing server room, watching the last hope of a 7-year-old girl being erased by corporate greed, Caroline Sterling realized that a legacy built on a graveyard of human collateral was worthless. She turned to Greg Mitchell. The ruthless CEO was gone. In her place stood a woman ready to burn her own empire to the ground. "Greg," Caroline said, her voice ringing with absolute terrifying clarity, "I need you to physically sever the main fiber optic trunk to the outside grid. Now." Greg Mitchell stared at Caroline, his hand hovering over the master console. In his 10 years of managing security for Sterling Global, he had never been given an order so utterly destructive. Severing the main fiber optic trunk wouldn't just disconnect Sector 4. It would violently air-gap the entire Chicago data hub from the global network, causing millions of dollars in instant latency damages. "Caroline," Greg warned, his voice tight, "if I cut the physical line, the purge will stop, yes. But we will blind the entire logistics grid. Blake will have you arrested for corporate sabotage." "Do it, Greg! Cut the damn line!" Caroline screamed, her voice cracking with a raw, unhinged desperation that finally broke through Greg's professional hesitation. He didn't use the keyboard. Greg sprinted to the far wall, shattering the glass of the emergency utility panel with his elbow. He pulled out a pair of heavy-duty industrial bolt cutters meant for severing live power lines during a catastrophic fire. He ran to the main junction box, a massive steel cage housing the thick black cables that connected Sterling Global to the outside world. With a roar of effort, Greg clamped the heavy steel jaws around the primary fiber optic trunk and squeezed. Crack! The sound echoed through the cavernous room like a gunshot. Instantly, the deafening hum of the cooling fans shifted pitch. The flashing red purge warnings on the monitors froze, then dissolved into a sea of amber error messages. Connection lost. Local host isolated. Caroline collapsed against a server rack, gasping for breath. The purge had been halted. By physically cutting the cable, she had trapped the remaining data in a closed, localized loop. The quantum array couldn't be wiped remotely by the board, but it could still finish its final calculation using the building's internal power grid. Before she could even catch her breath, the fire doors burst open. Richard Blake marched into the room, his face purple with rage, followed closely by the forensic auditors and 2 armed building security guards. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Blake bellowed, staring in horror at the severed cables sparking faintly on the raised floor. "You just blacked out the entire Midwest logistics network. You're done, Caroline. I'm having you physically removed from the premises and pressing federal charges." Caroline stood up slowly, brushing the dust off her designer skirt. The panic was gone, replaced by the freezing, terrifying calm of a billionaire who had just decided to go to war. "You aren't pressing charges, Richard," Caroline said, stepping into his personal space. "And you aren't removing me. Because as of 5 minutes ago, the only completed, flawless copy of Project Aegis, the algorithm this board needs to avoid bankruptcy, is sitting on an encrypted, offline drive in my vault. If you fire me, Aegis goes with me. The board loses billions." Sterling Global collapses by Q3. Blake sneered, though a flicker of doubt crossed his eyes. "You're bluffing. You don't have the final code." "Try me," Caroline whispered, her eyes dead and cold. "Call the police, put me in handcuffs, and watch our stock price hit 0 by Monday morning." While the standoff froze the server room in a tense silence, across the city in the rotting warehouse, Daniel Porter was living a nightmare. His monitors had gone completely black when the remote purge initiated. He had fallen to his knees beside Chloe's bed, holding her small, trembling hand as her breathing grew impossibly shallow. He had failed. 3 years of running, hiding, and calculating, only to have the cure snatched away mere seconds before the finish line. Suddenly, a harsh, mechanical whirring sound broke the silence of the warehouse. Daniel's head snapped up. His central monitor flickered to life. It wasn't connected to the Sterling Global mainframe anymore. The network indicator was dead. But the local terminal, the backdoor loop he had physically hardwired into the servers, was receiving a massive, compressed data dump. Caroline hadn't just stopped the purge. By severing the line, she had forced the quantum array to dump its active memory directly into the only open port left: Daniel's localized connection. The progress bar flashed on the screen. 99.8%, 99.9%, 100%. Synthesis complete. Outputting sequence. A complex, spiraling diagram of a synthetic protein chain populated the screen, followed by a precise, heavily detailed chemical recipe. Daniel let out a choked sob. He didn't waste a second. He slammed his hand on the printer button, grabbing the pages as they flew out of the tray. He packed his medical bags, wrapped Chloe in a heavy thermal blanket, and carried her out into the pouring rain to his rusted sedan. He drove like a madman to the private laboratory in Hammond, Indiana. It was an off-the-books facility run by a former Mayo Clinic colleague who owed Daniel his life. For the next 12 hours, Daniel worked in a sterile frenzy. Utilizing advanced CRISPR, Cas9 splicing techniques, he followed the quantum array's blueprint to the letter, synthesizing the bespoke biological serum. By the time he finished, his hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the syringe. Chloe was non-responsive, her pulse a faint terrifying flutter. Daniel administered the injection directly into her intravenous line. Then he sat on the cold tile floor of the lab, put his head in his hands, and waited for the universe to render its final verdict. 48 hours later, Caroline Sterling sat alone in her penthouse office. The building was quiet. She had survived the board's wrath, but just barely. She had traded the Aegis algorithm for her immunity and her position, but the fight had cost her heavily. Blake was plotting his next move, and the FBI was asking uncomfortable questions about the severed network cables. She stared out at the Chicago skyline, feeling a hollow ache in her chest. She had heard nothing from Daniel. No call, no message. The silence was agonizing. Her private cell phone buzzed. She lunged for it, recognizing the blocked number. "Daniel," she answered, her heart in her throat. She opened her eyes. "Caroline!" Daniel's voice came through the speaker, thick with tears, exhaustion, and overwhelming joy. "Her vitals are stabilizing. The degeneration has stopped." The neurologist said, "He's never seen anything like it. She's going to live." Caroline let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 3 weeks. She closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank God. I owe you my daughter's life," Daniel said softly. "I don't know how I could ever repay you." Caroline opened her eyes, wiping her cheek, the ruthless, visionary CEO returning to the surface, but this time guided by a new compass. "Actually, Dr. Porter, you can start by accepting a new job," Caroline said, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in years. "I'm restructuring. Sterling Global is launching a new subsidiary, Sterling Therapeutics. We are going to use the Aegis profit margins to fund a dedicated quantum computing medical research facility, and I need a CEO to run it." There was a long silence on the line. "Caroline, the FDA, the medical boards, I'm blacklisted. Nobody will fund me. I have $5 billion in liquid capital and the most advanced servers on the planet. I don't care about the FDA's blacklist. We will bulldoze them," Caroline promised fiercely. "You cured an incurable disease in a warehouse with stolen Wi-Fi. Imagine what you can do with a legitimate lab and infinite resources. Deal?" A soft, familiar laugh echoed over the line. "We have a deal." 1 year later, the world was stunned by the sudden, explosive launch of Sterling Therapeutics. Their first patent, a revolutionary, genetically tailored treatment for Lee syndrome and related neurometabolic disorders, was fast-tracked for FDA approval, backed by impossibly flawless clinical data. At the press conference, Caroline Sterling stood at the podium, unshakable and commanding. But when the press asked who the genius was behind the miraculous breakthrough, she stepped aside. She yielded the microphone to Dr. Daniel Porter. He stepped into the flashing lights, no longer wearing a faded canvas jacket, but a sharp, tailored suit. And standing right beside him, holding his hand with bright, healthy eyes, was a little girl named Chloe. Caroline watched them from the wings, the ultimate realization washing over her. The greatest power she had ever wielded wasn't found in corporate takeovers, billions of dollars, or cutting-edge algorithms. It was found in a dark room, in a single moment of empathy, when she chose to look past the uniform of a janitor and saw the desperate, brilliant humanity of a father fighting for his child. Power isn't about the empires we build. It's about the lives we choose to save when no one else is watching. Caroline and Daniel's story proves that sometimes the greatest miracles are hiding in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to break the rules. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, share it to inspire others, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life dramas.